So this is Module 10 of Introduction to Law, and we're heading towards the end. We're in the last final run. So it's all very exciting. We've been on a bit of a journey this term, and hopefully by now you'll have a better picture of whether you are seeing yourself as in a legal career, one of those legal, or having that as one of your career options, or whether it's something you're not much interested in which case, you know, it's a good opportunity to start thinking about what other options you have and where you can go, because there's no point staying in a degree program that you're not enjoying after the first 6 months. You know, it's one of the really unfortunate things about the way our degree programs work at the moment is you've got to commit to like whole degrees, and then if you don't like it, you've got to transfer out. And one of the advantages, I think, of the US model is that you get a bit of an opportunity to try some different things before you commit to a full degree. But we're not going to get that anytime soon, and Melbourne University's experiment with a US-style model doesn't seem to have done them any favours. I mean, they still have huge numbers of students and everything, but it doesn't seem to have worked in their favour. Anyway, so this module's looking at legislation and what I think Wayne described as commentaries, but we're really talking about journal articles, really. That's the main thing that you're going to be looking at. There are also specialist commentary services on some areas of law. Now you're not going to need to know about that for this subject, but it's worth bearing in mind that some pieces of legislation, for instance, the Tax Act, the Constitution, there are specialist services which are a section by section commentary. So they're a commercial service, so they cost money. Bad news. Good news is while you're a student, if you have the subscription paid as part of your student fees, but they can be useful in that they're a commercial service and they update when there's a case on that particular piece of legislation. But it's generally the big ones. It's things like the Criminal Code, if you're in Queensland, the Crimes Act, if you're elsewhere, Constitution, tax laws. I'm sure there's some others as well. But the majority of times when you're looking for secondary sources, you'll be looking at journal articles. And I guess at textbooks as well. All right, so the first question is involving looking at the Criminal Code, finding a particular section, and locating, well, first of all, locating the Criminal Code. So where would you go looking for the Criminal Code? Ideas. Queensland legislation? Yeah, any ideas of specifically like URLs you'd look for Queensland legislation? Austlie's one option, and Lauren said the Queensland legislation website. So there's two options. The advantage of Austlii is that everything's there and it's all in plain text format, which makes it generally easier to copy and paste from. Legislation websites have, thank you, the advantage that they're often in PDFs and they just look nicer and are easier to read because of that. So let's have a quickly you don't want to look at Zoom. Look at the Queensland legislation website and you can search for current legislation. C for Criminal Code. Somewhere down here. It's often interesting to look through these repositories just to see what there's legislation on, because sometimes you're quite so Sometimes there's things you're quite surprised, and like you'll see the Criminal Code animal values regulation. What all that's all about. So you can go into it from here, and you'll actually get a PDF of the Act. All 586 pages of it. I haven't looked at it recently to see whether it still has offences like pretending to practice witchcraft in it. When I studied it, it had pretending to practice witchcraft, which caused a great deal of amusement. Alrighty. The other thing that's useful here is you can link to historical versions, and you can understand, and you can use those to look at how acts have changed. Because one of the advantages of electronic media is that you get completely up-to-date acts, but it also can be difficult to see what acts changed the acts at various times and what was involved. So if there's just one minor change in a particular piece of legislation, that's generally okay. But sometimes there'll be a whole suite of changes that occur at the same time, and they're all interconnected. And if you're going to actually deal with that act in any kind of depth, you need to go back and find out exactly what happened at the same time. So it can get quite complicated, particularly on large and very old acts like the Criminal Code. And again, I mean, I don't want to sound too much like a stuck record talking about this stuff, but it's one of those things that the experience is very, very important. And finding the time, I know everyone's busy and everyone has a busy schedule, but finding time to develop those skills to actually understand acts, to understand when you don't have pressure, when you don't have an assignment that's due in 2 days' time, you actually just spend some time looking at it. It's very important. So back in the old ancient days, it was a case of saying, spend some time in the law library, wander around, have a look at what's there. Of course, we're now all virtual. It's the same sort of principle. It's a case of, developing those skills and understanding the genre. And legislation is written in a very particular way. Okay, Lawrence said I got very distracted perusing all the other legislation. It's really true. There's all kinds of things, and you think, what do they regulate about that? Okay, and Lawrence also mentioned, found at the end of the Act, there was the notes section, which talks about which amendments occurred and what was involved. That's a reasonably recent innovation. One of the advantages of OSLI is you can jump straight to that part of the Act, which is good. And more recent acts and more recent amendments, they'll actually have that index at the end, and it's generally under the section notes, which will tell you what's happened where, what sections were amended, and it'll give you at least a start to understand when the changes occurred. So then you can actually then go and find the amending act, and the amending act will help you. The other thing you could find is the ancillary material, like the second reading speech that goes with that act. So generally speaking, everyday law, everyday study of law, you don't need that sort of detail. You just want to know what the current law is now. But sometimes things have changed and you need to know. And this is the sort of thing that if we wanted to be really devious, we would set as an exam question or an assignment question. You take a piece of legislation, you'd ask you to discuss a case, but we'd set you a case that occurred before recent amendments. So what you'd have to be able to do is you'd have to be able to check the Act and see that amendments occurred after that particular case, and to be able to discuss the fact that what the changes were and why they occurred. Now, I'm not going to do that to you for this subject, but fully expect that that's the sort of thing that can occur, because it's the sort of thing that occurs in the real world. And the last thing you want to do is to be putting pressure and to say, well, okay, I've got this particular provision and I've got a case that discusses it and this is this. And for someone, particularly a judge, to turn around and say, but isn't that isn't that case irrelevant now because of the new amendments to the Act? And if you're then sort of opening and closing your mouth like a goldfish, it's you get very embarrassed by those things. So being able to understand when changes have occurred, being able to check that stuff is really important. And as I said, that's a bit of an insider trick for as a lecturer, is to set you a topic and to ask you to discuss a case that has subsequently been modified, and not to tell you that it's been subsequently modified. All right, what are the other parts of this question? Since we found the Act and we've got to find section 218A, how do you find cases that have involved the interpretation of that section?
I've read LexisNexis IU. Can you hear me?
Yeah. How would you find cases that are
well? I've tried LexisNexis AU and I couldn't find the cases.
Okay. Well, LexisNexis is a big site with lots of things in it.
Yes.
Anyone else? Ostly noting up, shepherdizing, if you want to be American about it. I'll show you first point. Ostly note up is the one I use because it's free. And that's most efficient. But I will show you providing that it works. I'll show you first point. Okay. Now, it's timed me out. This is what I get for being too efficient. And it's now logged me back into something completely the wrong thing. All right, let's go back to the library site. I was being too clever and trying to get in before, so I had everything ready. Okay, you should be able to use the library site. It's not brilliant. It's a bit clunky, but again, it's one of those things that if you know what you're doing, it's going to be easier when you have to deal with it under time pressure. Okay, so we look for first point, which is a commercial service. There's a few others mentioned in your book. First point, electronic resource. And what's the wrong button there? Because it would have been a lot easier if the rest of you guys did it. Just gone into Oslo, but I'm determined to be stubborn and actually show you. There we are. It's in databases under F, of course. All right. Go to legislation commentary.
Well, the legislation title, okay. Legislation title.
Code. Act. One of the problems with Moodle, of course, is that there's with Zoom is you end up with too many. I need another monitor. Okay. I think you guys were probably right in using OSLI, actually. But theoretically, okay, theoretically, this is a commercial service. We pay a lot of money for it. You should be able to get into First Point and search, here we are under the legislation cited. Oops. Criminal Code section 218A. All right. And that should provide links to relevant cases. And here it says the Crown and McGrath. And there you go. There's a case. I think it's asking you for 2 cases, is it? At least 2 cases. According to First Point, there is only 1 case. Very helpful, First Point, that deals with this particular issue. So again, it's always the case that when you're trying to do a tech demo, things are never going to work properly. But First Point will let you get into the full details of those cases, and it should also get you into other cases. So at the top here, it'll tell you what cases cite that particular case, what cases distinguished it, which cases applied it, and which cases considered it. So what you end up doing is developing a kind of a network of cases from that initial case, so you can actually look at what happened in terms of the history of precedent. History is not really the right word, is it? It's the future developments of that particular precedent, although it's history for us because we're looking back at it now, but where it was also considered. It also refers you to journal articles as well. So it's a useful service, but as I said, it's something that is a commercial service, which is great while you're a student, but in practice, most people don't have this, and even big firms don't have this. I know some students who were acting as who were working as interns, and they were working at a rather large firm whose name I will not mention because this is, grossly illegal what they were doing. But they were asking the students for their student login and password to actually get in to access all these resources because the firm didn't actually pay for them. So there you go. And Lauren has used OSLI, the free service, and come up with a much better set of cases. Great ethics demonstration, yeah. If you guys end up doing intellectual property law, you'll hear a lot more of my opinions about intellectual property and the way in which these big companies are basically locking us out of information that should be public information. So I won't bore you with a diatribe on intellectual property law tonight. But if you're interested in that sort of thing, you could do IP law as an elective and find out much more about these issues. Okay, so I guess the moral of the story is that OSLI is a lot more efficient to use. How about this next part of the question? When was the section added to the Criminal Code? When was section 208A added? I'm going to check to see if Westlaw helps us. One of the things that really bugs me about this is this is actually the First Point service, and I don't think it mentions the word First Point anywhere on the page. Anyway, 218A. Code. And I'm going to get distracted and ask Lois what IP case was mentioned on Triple J the other day while I'm doing the searching.
It was a case where a photographer had seen a photo that she had taken of some member of a band or something, and he had posted it like it was his own without giving her credit. And his argument was, well, if you've taken a photo of me, I'm entitled to use it. And her argument was, well, I had to apply to be at that gig and pay to be there to take photos. Yeah. And they were saying, they were talking to her on Triple J.
It's interesting. I wonder if people would think the same thing if you painted a portrait of them. If you painted a portrait of them, they'd say, well, it's a picture of me, therefore I can do what I like with it, and I own it because it's a picture of me. I mean, the copyright law is kind of clear that the photographer owns the copyright, although there's some weird stuff happening in Europe where they're trying to stop people being able to take photographs of buildings. They're trying to change their copyright law to have some kind of sense of copyright in buildings to stop people taking photos of them. That stuff is real. There's some really weird stuff in IP law. Okay, so as Westlaw proves to tell me that it doesn't know anything about the criminal code, Karen has actually found when the amendment was passed and then re-amended in 2013, and I'm guessing you used Ostley to do that. Moral of the story is sometimes free is best. And Lauren's comment about men with cameras taking pictures at the beach. It's a weird world we live in, and you become very suspicious of everyone. And one of the things that's interesting about IP law is it seems to give you the answers on the surface, and the more you dig, the more complicated it gets. Because copyright in particular was designed just to stop actual copies of things, like copying an actual book. And some of the things we've applied copyright law to are completely out of the original ballpark. Probably fair enough to say no, but very polite of them to ask, because many people don't consider that they should have to ask people. And that's really, I guess, more of an area of privacy law than intellectual property. And privacy law, again, another interesting, strange, and complicated area of law. Anyway, getting back to what we're supposed to be talking about tonight, which is when the section was added, way back when we found out when, and we used Ostley, I believe, to find that out. I am going to jump out of Westlaw and back into Ostley, because Westlaw, here I was going to show you how great the commercial product was, and I would be a terrible product tester. A criminal code. The main problem with Ostley is that its search engine's a bit primitive because it's built on open source technologies, and it certainly isn't as good at finding things straight away as say Google is. But I'm a big believer in Ostley because of the political context of it, that law should be free and should be accessible. So, okay, we've found the section much more easily. And if we go to notes, that just gives us notes on the actual whole act. Okay. If we go, oh, I didn't mean to do that. If you go to the, this was probably a bad piece of legislation to pick in some ways because it's so long and complicated. But somewhere in here, there should be a section that says notes. And that should tell you when the amending legislation was put through. Okay, anyway, let's not get sidetracked by that. So make sure you know how to locate legislation, you know how to check when sections were passed, and you know how to shepherdize them. Now, the problem, I've now got out of first point, but the reason why first point is superior in many ways is that the noting up in OSLI is very rudimentary, and there really isn't anything there. So when I was back in first point, and I'm going to try and log back into that again, it actually was better at giving us cases and articles that discussed that particular provision. So I would use, for just everyday use, I'd use OSLI, but I would persevere with something like First Point, or Westlaw AU, as they seem to be calling it now, in order to get that extra information, because it does have more in there. Chris said found dates in the notes at the end of the Act, which is what I was looking for in the table. And I couldn't find it on that list. So the online version from the government might have actually, the government website might have that. Chris,
yeah, Scott.
Yes.
Scott Ivan here. I found the quickest way was to look at the PDF on the Queensland legislation.
Yeah.
And if you just sit down to the end of the Act, it gives you a table of all of the provisions that have been amended.
Excellent.
When they were amended.
That's what I was thinking would be the way to do it. And I was surprised because I looked at the OSLI, because OSLI should have had that in there as well. I'm not really sure why it did. But let's go into that. There we go. There's the end notes in the PDF version, which has when all the amendments took place. That's what we were looking for. So, one of the things about research is that sometimes there's not one direct route to the information you need, and sometimes you have to try a couple of different ways. All right, so I think that's legislation. Do I have anything else to talk about in terms of legislation? I think it's probably a good thing to print out a piece of legislation, particularly if it's in a subject that you're going to be looking at it in depth, and spend some time looking at the way in which legislation works and look at the way in which sections and subsections work. Because one of the problems I have with the notes, the textbooks that have, collected materials and whatever, and they just put extracts of legislation, is you never really get a picture of how things work and interlock. Now, I would not recommend you do that with the criminal code because it's 586 pages. But I recommend if you pick something that's maybe a 40-page act, print it out and spend some time having a look at how it actually all works and how the bits of it fit together. And one of the things you might find quite surprising is how much of legislation the content of legislation is usually enabling sections. So sometimes there'll be an act which is, the act to do this particular thing or to prohibit this particular thing. And the core of the act might only be 1 or 2 sentences. It might only be 1 or 2 provisions. But then the rest of the act is setting up who has the power, who has the responsibility, how their regulations are created, and so on. So it's a good thing to get a feel of. I mean, if you're doing contracts, then something like the Fair Trading Act or the equivalent in your particular jurisdiction would be a good one to have a look at. I'm not sure what the Queensland one is called. I think it might be called the Consumer Affairs Act or something like that. I'm on the C page. I'll have a quick squiz. If you're doing contract at the moment, you'll probably have a better idea than I have. The Victorian one is the Fair Trading Act. And that deals with consumer rights. And maybe it's fair trading in Queensland as well. There you go. It is fair trading in Queensland. Oh, it's 126 pages. But I'd recommend getting something like this one to have a look at, something that's relevant to your studies, and just spend some time going through it and looking at where the operative sections are and what the rest of it does. So you'll see in the Fair Trading Act, the actual operative sections, here we go, are sort of clustered around one particular part, and a lot of the rest of the Act is concerned with things like registers and forfeiting and remedies and so on that are actually attached to that, and the fantastic transitional provisions for when you've actually affecting other pieces of legislation. And you get a sense of how complicated it is. And when you have to be able to pass all these provisions through Parliament, how costly it is to actually change legislation, particularly if Parliament's consumed with, doing something else at the time. Anyway, so that's legislation, and sorry if I sound like a bit of a cracked record when I say things like this, but I'm saying things like this out of experience, that if you spend some time of your own initiative looking at stuff, it helps. It really does. Don't be the kind of person who sits back and says, well, the lecturer hasn't told me I have to do it. I don't, it's not accessible, I'm not going to do it. Take initiative, and it's actually very rewarding. Karen just mentioned Firearm and Offensive Weapons Act is similar. So there'll be a little section in there somewhere that says it's an offence to carry illegal firearms. It'll have maybe a bit of a definition of what those are. And then it may then have a section that says what the penalties is, and then there's lots and lots of other stuff that actually is the machinery that makes those basic provisions work and operate. Criminal code is actually quite unique in that there's a lot of content in the criminal code. A lot of legislation doesn't have so much in there. All right. Anyone got any, before we move on to secondary sources, anyone got any questions or observations around legislation? Any exciting legislation you want to look up? I know there's one that's probably everyone's burning to see. So the CQU Act. $1998. There we go. This is what makes a university work. how it's set up, how meetings of council are organised, so on and so forth. The universities actually exist as administrative bodies established under state legislation, which leads from an interesting set of contradictions because all the funding comes from the Commonwealth government. And yet education is something which is under the power of the state government, the Constitution. So you'll do more of this stuff when you do constitutional law, but I thought that might be something that you might find vaguely interesting to me, that the university itself is a creature of legislation. It exists because it's created by this, and it tells you what the functions of the university are. To provide education at a university standard, to disseminate knowledge and promote scholarship, form other functions. Okay. Anything about the dual sector? Yeah, I wonder if that's in here. I think they would have had to have amended the legislation. It says it's up to date at 2014. I think that might have been where that they had to include that. I mean, did I just go past? Completely by accident. University is a dual sector entity. There you go. And that was refers to the TAFE Queensland Act 2013. Just as the TAFE's funding was being completely disemboweled. So yeah, even a simple thing like changing your business model of your university involves, legislative change. Legislative change involves someone in the Office of Parliamentary Counsel having to redraft it, do risk assessment. These days, in Queensland at least, and some of the other states, you have to do a regulatory impact statement, which means you have to actually be able to prepare a report that says these are the things that are going to be affected. And when you look at the sheer number of acts that are in the database now that are current live acts, it can be quite difficult to realise that that an act you may a provision you may change in a piece of legislation may impliedly repeal or alter a provision in another set of legislation. So anyway, that's legislation for you, or at least a very, very brief introduction to it. This is something where your skills of being able to read actively become very, very important, because even this one is a relatively short act. It's 68 pages. If someone were to, and here's an example of something that could be but isn't in the briefing paper exercise. It could be find out whether dual sector, the dual sector model is valid under the Central Queensland University Act, and then you'd have to be able to, in that short time period, find the right provisions, find what they say, be able to do a little bit of analysis. You do statutory interpretation next term. You'll do a lot more about what words actually mean. But what you're not going to be doing is starting at page 1 of the Act and reading all the way through to page 68. And similarly, if I give you a question on the criminal code, you're going to need to be able to find things within the 568 pages without starting, at the beginning and then reading all the way through. So it's a different set of reading skills. Okay, got a comment from Amanda. Off topic bit. High schools are going to introduce external exams for seniors. 50% supervised. Teachers are freaking out. Yeah, exams are an interesting thing. Exams, people love exams because they're easy on markers. They're much easier to mark than an assignment because you don't have to put comments on them. But educationally, they're not great. They're not actually modelling a real situation in any kind of way, because no one ever says to you, I need an answer to a problem. Now go sit in a room by yourself and work on it and don't talk to anyone else. I mean, that just never happens. But there's also a problem that a lot of people freeze and freak out in exams and don't do very well. And you often will see people who are getting really good grades and they hit an exam and they just bomb out because the stress gets to them. So personally, I don't think exams are a really good assessment method. But the problem is the issue of ghostwriting and people paying to have people write their assignments is now in the public mind. So every time that happens, you get a kind of a reactionary callback where people say, we've got to go back to basics, we've got to go back to invigilated exams, because that's the only way we can make sure the person who is doing the exam is the actual person. Problem with that also is that that's never been true, because IDs are really easy to fake. And even when I was at uni, people were getting family members to do their exams for them who looked kind of like them, looked kind of like their photo, and would just say, oh, you know, if anyone pulled them up on it, said, oh, I've just changed my hair. You know, I look different because I've got a different haircut or whatever. So yeah, even back in the bad old days, people were getting older siblings who had already graduated to go in and do exams for them when they hadn't prepared properly. I'm sure those people are now out there working as lawyers. And it says the stress of my exams make me physically ill. And there's a lot of people who have that sort of problem with exams. In the law arena, we're externally accredited with the Legal Practitioners Admission Board in Queensland. And we have to be very careful that what we do in assessment is credible. So you'll find from time to time in the law program, we have exams, and it's not because we love them, quite the opposite, but we are kind of having to pepper exams through the law program to try and, I guess, deflect any criticism that people might say when they say, well, students are just all buying their assignments anyway. And if you've never heard of academic ghostwriting, pretend I didn't say anything. But academic ghostwriting it's been in the media, and it's a big issue, and people are making quite, you know, a considerable amount of money writing assignments for students. All right. Let me have a quick exams test your ability to memorise, not so much your understanding and the ability to apply. No, that's quite true. Teachers get to understand a student's style of writing, and yeah, I mean, that's one of the things where getting people that you're engaging regularly with students and observing what they do. And, you know, one of the purposes of things like the problem solving toolkit was just to get you to show us what you do and how you're thinking, so we can get to know you a bit better. Pass rates are going to be a problem. Problem for whom, I guess? Dual sector, can we go back to that comment? I'm not sure what this is or means in relation to what we're looking at. I missed the response. We were just looking at the Enabling Act for the Central Queensland University, and the fact that it has sections in there on the dual sector, the TAFE and higher ed. Because you make big changes, you've got to actually change the legislation. It was not completely relevant to anything, it was just a matter of curiosity. Okay, let's leave the Central Queensland University Act for a moment. Because, again, we're getting distracted, but it shouldn't take, the questions are not terribly long tonight. Question 2 involves finding journal articles. Where do you go looking for journal articles? Someone chime in the chat session sector, or turn your mic on or whatever. Because I'm genuinely curious as where you do go looking for articles. If you do.
Scott, Ivan, I find the AGIS database a good source for legal articles, and it's very easy to search as well.
Okay, ATIS.
No, AGIS, the Attorney General's Information Service.
Yes, again.
And I'm not sure if it's on the CQU databases, but I use the State Library of Queensland services, and they've got, in addition to LexisNexis, they've also got subscriptions to other databases like the Attorney General Information Service as well. And that's a free service that you can use just by registering on the library website to access their information.
Yeah, and it pre-exists a lot of the other services as well. AGIS, Attorney General's Information Service, has a venerable history. It doesn't have everything on it, but it's been around since the early days of the internet, and it was one of those interesting things where sometimes the problem with it is the things that you find, because it's a citation service, it doesn't necessarily have links to the full text of the articles, and then the articles are actually locked in behind a paywall. And fortunately, some of the articles behind the paywall are things that you have subscriptions to through the library, as people have pointed out. You use the library site to find the actual journal itself. But I guess there's two stages to it. The first is actually finding out what the full reference is, and once you find that out, so for instance, Lauren has found that it comes from the James Cook University Law Review. Often what you then have to do is go into the library site, look for the title, and search. Why we have such a tiny search window, I don't know. The library server isn't found. That's nice. I'm interested in this, the sites that John's mentioned, Cite This For Me and citationmention.net, which I'll have a look at in a sec. No one's mentioned Google Scholar, which is interesting.
I don't know whether you can hear me or not.
Yes.
Scott?
I can.
Oh, awesome. I'm on a bit of a dodgy internet connection, but yeah, I used Cite This For Me, and I found it really easy. It was really good for pulling references that I'd already had, rather than having to type them manually into EndNote, which I know once they're in there, they're in there. But you just type in a very brief reference with Cite This For Me, even like an ISBN for a book, and it goes off and picks it up off the internet, and means that you don't have to do lots of manual entry of sources. I found it really, really helpful.
Yeah.
And the paid version of Cite This For Me, which I can't remember how much it was. I ended up taking a month's subscription because you can then store your work. On the free version, you can store it for 7 days, which would be useful for an assignment. But if you needed it for longer, there is a paid subscription.
It's annoying that it doesn't have Australian Guide to Legal Citation style, that you'd have to then change it to the AGL.
It does actually.
Does it? Okay.
Yeah, you go into the referencing, I think, citation guides, and yeah, it does have AGLC. Or I think where it says citation style and it's got MLA on the screen, you change that to AGLC, which you have to search by typing in Australian, and then it'll bring up Australian Guide to Legal Citation. It's pretty good. I had to check each source or each citation to make sure it was right, and I did have to do a little bit of manual tweaking, but it does save a lot of time. And the citationmachine.net is the other one that also looks pretty good, and I think that's free, but I haven't actually used that one. But that's worth having a look at too.
It's funny, these services that are like citation, and there's been a big discussion about EndNote, which we're getting to now, always used to be something you did after the fact. You didn't actually use as part of research. But they're now becoming so embedded. The other one that I think is really interesting is there's a free one called, and if EndNote, you can get it through the uni, by all means, grab it while you're a student. But there's one called Zotero. I'll type the spelling in the chat window, which is a plugin for Firefox, and it works like EndNote in that you can just clip things and add it to Zotero, and then pull it out into a Word doc later on. And one of the things that it does well that I think EndNote is trying to play catch up with is that you can share references. Now, that's obviously not going to be such a big deal while you're a student, and you're not supposed to be technically sharing research on it. Well, not that there's a problem with sharing a little bit of research on assignments, but if you're actually doing group research and a group project, Zotero is really good because you can actually just create a folder that has all the relevant stuff for a project, and people can just keep adding things to it. And it kind of has that sort of social bookmarking feature. Last I heard, EndNote was suing Zotero. There was some kind of complicated thing going on, but Zotero still operates. And what it gives you is a little Z on your taskbar, so that when you find something, you can click onto Zotero and it opens a box down the bottom of the screen. And you've got various folders that you can add things to. And it stores the citations, and then you can export them to Word. So these are all things that are beyond the scope of this particular course. You'll be doing legal research as a subject in Year 2. And I will definitely be looking at Cite This For Me and Citation Machine for that particular subject. As time goes on, more of the research that you're going to be doing is going to be involving groups of people. So in some ways, the whole individual university assignment, while I'm sure you understand the reason for it, is not something that's realistic in the work environment. In the work environment, you're generally creating and sharing research, shared resources. All right. Okay, let's get rid of Zotero. The other things are sort of like social bookmarking and things too that we can talk about later. So anyway, the old way of looking for articles was basically you went to a database and you went looking in that particular database. Now we have lots of options, and you generally only go to the databases under the library site, like Hein Online, for instance, when you're actually trying to find the full text of a particular article and you can't find it because it's locked behind a paywall. What you'll generally do is use something like Google Scholar or AGIS, or you will use one of the more innovative new things like Zotero or EndNote, or I'm trying to think of what there's a social bookmarking one. I'm totally blanking on it. Anyway, you use one of those services to actually find your reference, but then you've got that difficult and awkward stage of then, well, how do I actually find the text? Where is it? Do we have copies of it? And as Karen has pointed out, Ostley actually has the articles in question. Do we have full text of those? Let me have a quick look. Brilliant, we do. That's extremely unusual, though. Most journals are closed, and most journals are owned by Elsevier, which is kind of the Monsanto of the university publishing world. And they basically squeeze universities for more and more for subscriptions each year. And as a result, universities like ours, which is one of the the less wealthy universities in Australia are having to cut down severely on the number of journals that we give students access to, which is very, very unfortunate. Okay, so we've had lots and lots of different options here. I personally start with Google Scholar, but that's probably because I'm a little bit old-fashioned and I still think about searching directly. Other people have found lots of different options for finding things. What do we need to do? We need to find the article, we need to find the journal, and find the full text. So usually the biggest trick in that is actually finding the full text, and often at the end of the day, you're back to where we were when we started, which is the library website, and being able to find, say, the Sydney Law Review. Which it doesn't look like we have access to anyway. Ooh, that's unfortunate. Let's see if we've got the James. Actually, I searched for author there. Silly, silly, silly title. Thought we should have that. Sydney Law Review, electronic journal. We have full text. Sometimes it's really annoying that we only have full text between certain years, and that's because of complicated licensing deals that you don't need to know about. So here it says Sydney Law Review from 1953 to present, and that's under that particular journal subscription service. Sometimes we have more than one subscription service. It might be in one or the other. In fact, this is taking us to the Ostley version anyway. So it's taking us to a free version. All right, but you get the idea though that if something is locked behind a paywall and you get to it and it says we're going to charge you $50 for this article, go back to the library site, go back to here, and look to see if the library has a copy of it. Fingers crossed they will. Otherwise, you then end up trying to find someone who is from another university who might have a better subscription service. Okay. Anyway, I'll stop sharing the screen. Go back to there. So are we reasonably confident about finding legislation and finding journal articles? Seems you guys are mostly on top of that, which is good. Next week is the last formal coursework week. You're not going to know what to do with your Wednesday nights. And we're primarily looking at international and intra-jurisdictional issues next week. So how to find EU law, Canadian law, English law. I don't know if New Zealand law. Oh yeah, we do cover the US law as well. Most of which are not, well, none of them are binding on us. It used to be back in the day that New Zealand and Canada and the UK were very influential on us because we were part of the same kind of Commonwealth common law heritage, but less so these days. Okay.
Scott, may I ask a question, Scott? So next Wednesday night is the last Zoom session. Have I got this right? And then the following Wednesday in the morning, you release the briefing paper, but there's no Zoom session that night.
There will be. I don't know whether people want to come along to that. I will be here to answer questions. I mean, I'm not going to answer the whole thing, but I'll make sure that session I'll be available just more as office hours for people who want to have a chat.
About the briefing paper?
Yeah. One of the things, look, I have to toe the company line in terms of collaboration on assignments, and I have to warn people that if you collaborate to an extent that's amounts to plagiarism, there will be penalties and everything else involved. However, I'm not so naive as to think that people don't discuss assignment topics, and I would rather have some of that happen where I could see it and be involved than just to close my eyes to it and go, oh, it's no one's talking about it, and then just know that people are on Facebook or whatever and are actually discussing it anyway. So I'd rather have an opportunity for people to talk about things and ask questions while I was present and, able to contribute than kind of forcing that stuff underground. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. So let's go quickly back before we end. Pizza Man has just turned up, as you can no doubt hear. So when are we likely to receive the results of our toolkit assessment? Within 2 weeks of submission. So if you are submitting with an extension, that of course pushes the date back. We had some trouble getting the marker appointed because the university bureaucracy in Rockhampton happens very slow. I should probably stop recording there. Things seem to happen very slowly in Rockhampton, and I think a crocodile might have eaten the application. But the marker has been appointed and is steadily progressing. I'm marking some of them, she's marking the others. So we're, fingers crossed, on track for 2 weeks. That's the set turnaround for assessment pieces. Chris has said it's case law where I struggle. Case law is where everyone struggles. And again, it's one of those things of it's just, having, finding the right ones to read, the right cases to read. And sometimes that's a matter of just asking the lecturers in a particular subject, saying, which are good, really good cases to read. Because some cases you just want that paragraph. There's a paragraph in there somewhere, and sometimes we'll reproduce it in the notes. That's all you need to know. Justice McHugh said on page 700, by way of obiter dicta, this. But other cases, you can actually really get your teeth into, and you can actually look at, there's 3 different perspectives, and 2 of them agree, but they get to the conclusion in a different way. And those are the ones where I think if you can get recommendations from academics, it's worth spending some time with them. Constitutional law is a good one for that. So if I was teaching constitutional law, I would say definitely political broadcasting case, which is the one on implied rights under the Constitution. All the judges say something different. All the judges say something really interesting. You can get your teeth into it. It's a subject you can understand. A lot of appeal court cases, you don't have the context, and you read them and you go, I don't know what they're talking about, because they're talking about, an application ex parte to a motion to do something. You just don't understand what that's all about. And unless you're really, really familiar with the law, the actual appeal doesn't make a lot of sense on its own. But there are some. I'm more, constitutional seems to have really good ones. The Crown and Dietrich, brilliant one to have a read of. Anyway, that's just my hints for case law, is not to try and read absolutely everything, not just to pick stuff at random and read, but find out from your academic staff which ones are interesting and actually useful to actually be able to read and compare. Okay. If we can get the answers, that's not going to happen. Preferred method to speak with me, generally email a time that I can call you. Is generally a good time if you want to have a chat. My time's reasonably flexible, particularly during the day, which I know some of you are working during the day. But if you want to have a chat about something, just email me and say, can you give me a call on this day or this day, and give me a couple of times. I'm currently wading through course notes on administrative law for next term at the moment. So it's a bit like having an assignment due. I'm looking for any excuse to do something that's not finishing my notes for next term. So I've got, any excuse to talk to people. Alrighty. Possible to upload Zoom as soon as possible. I will start downloading it as soon as we finish, and upload it as soon as I can. All right, so we've gone over time by a little bit. Thank you all again for your attendance, for your engagement, your interesting comments, your fascinating legal problems involving pervy men with cameras. I just finally thought of an answer to that particular problem, which was, can I take a picture of your child? There's no, can I take a picture of you? Maybe that was an interesting way to respond to them. I'd like to take a picture of you. See how that response is. Okay. Good night, everyone.